Hi everyone, and welcome to Goat House Church. This video sermon is going to be about, I titled it Mystic Water and Mystic Land, but it's kind of a succession off of what we had done last video, which was about the masculine and the feminine aspects. All right. So just to recap again on the masculine and the feminine, we first saw that the masculine principle was like the light of God, right? And the feminine was that dark void of potential. Now, this idea is simple enough to understand, especially if we compare it to our very own male and female aspects, right? Since we have said that the male basically informs the female with his seed, and then basically this would be like the light that shines down to that potential void that we had read in Genesis, right? And then the life comes forth from the potential of the feminine womb, right? So this also helps us understand how space, as far as space and time goes, is considered masculine, since space is what appears out of that dark void, right? So space, like we said, is kind of like that tiny flame that's in a dark room, okay? Just like that tiny spark of life that we see in the mother's womb, okay? And therefore time, which is the period where the seed's developing as the child, that becomes a feminine trait, since the feminine holds that gap of time, right? And this is where all the growth of that potential is happening. All right, so this week we're going to look at these things a little more from the psychological point of view, okay? Or how these ideas relate to what we experience in life, basically amongst each other. So one of these examples that I want to convey is kind of like when you're bringing a message like this across, am I giving too much logic, too much information, and no spirit or no feeling in the message? It's one thing that I personally struggle with. But you can see how this transfers from that masculine and feminine aspect, masculine being logos, which would be like the sun that's informing, and then feminine, which would be spirit, which is that which is receiving, right? So if I'm too logic, if I'm then I'm giving forth logos and just giving forth information and no feeling, and therefore you're probably struggling to connect. But if it's just feeling, and if I'm just connecting with you on an emotional level, then I'm lacking and being able to provide a good sense of logic or a good sense of deep understanding of what message I'm trying to convey. Okay. So there is this almost dual nature that's always working between us, right? And in some sense, they're opposites technically, but they're necessary to balance each other out. And this, of course, is part of the creation myth where God said, where it's not good for Adam to be alone. And he pulled Eve from his side, right? So the actual translation for Eve is something like opposite or challenger, really, but in a positive sense, all right? So it's as if to act in opposition, but for the sake of making something or someone better, right? Like a coach would be almost for like a football or a baseball team or something like that, right? They discriminate and they pick out the players' weak areas so that they can challenge the team to become stronger. Okay, that's the idea. So even though we see this concept of the masculine and the feminine within Genesis here, at first glance, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of emphasis on these two natures throughout the rest of the Christian scripture. At least not if you're looking at it in the way that we're used to looking at it. Okay? But many Eastern religions, for instance, they very much emphasize the masculine and the feminine. And one of these is the Chinese religion or philosophy of Taoism. Okay, and Taoism is almost exclusively based on the balance of both masculine and feminine principles, and we can clearly see this through the well-known symbol of the yin yang that we see so often. I can't imagine that there's pretty much anyone that's listening to this that is not familiar with this particular symbol, right? But many of us, I think, have actually become almost too familiar with it. And what I mean by that is that there's a good chance that we've kind of taken it for granted. We've kind of taken for granted just how profound the symbol here really is. Since in a nutshell, it really kind of brings these concepts together in what appears really to be basic and a simple image, right? But the entire concept revolves around the union of, yes, the masculine and feminine qualities. So what is so significant here is the half black and the half white design is, of course, insinuating yin as the black and the what we would call chthonic nature of the feminine, and this was the dark void of potential. And then the white yang is, of course, then the informing light of the masculine. But then what we see is that both halves have these smaller circles of the opposing color within them, right? So what is that exactly supposed to mean? Well, it means that even though we are one gender, right, male or female, we have within us a portion of the opposing nature. So if we're male, we have a little bit of the feminine nature there within us, right? We're a little bit nurturers. And if we're female, there is some of that masculine nature that is within them as well. There is actually some psychological evidence for this, and it's what Carl Jung determined to be called both the anima in man and then the animus within the woman. And what's shown through analytical psychology is that these natures are often very much unconscious to us. They actually act out in these powerful ways, which often and many times we're almost completely unaware of, okay? So to really unpack that would require a good bit of time, but I would say this much, that according to Jung's psychological analysis, many times when you find yourself in any kind of an argument, and this is particularly an argument, with the opposite sex, of course, and you find yourself almost possessed by your emotions, right? And saying things that you would usually not say with a good, clear mind. This is most likely the possession of your anima or animus, okay? And since the vast majority of us have little to no understanding of this, we give no time really to properly integrating that pesky little unconscious psychological character that kind of goes rampant within us, right? And because this happens to be the case, they have far more control over us than what we actually have over them. And, here we thought that we couldn't be possessed, right? But hey, it kind of seems like that would appear to be the case at times. So yes, between Eastern religions and psychology, there is a ton of emphasis to balance out those two natures of both masculine and feminine, right? But then, is this not the case also for Christianity? And I would say, in fact, there is a very strong emphasis. It definitely seems to favor the masculine more than the feminine. I think what I'm going to show you is that is actually not entirely the case, okay? And in fact, I would argue that the entire Bible is really wrestling with the contrast between these masculine and feminine aspects, just as much as Taoism or any other of the other religions, okay? So it's not as obvious maybe within the Bible, And that's because the concepts are kind of hidden mostly within the biblical symbols. All right. So once you become familiar with reading the Bible through that symbolic lens, then you will see these contrasts in almost every biblical story. All right. So again, we have already determined that the light is masculine and the void of potential is the feminine, as we had said in the last sermon. But now the next most obvious and clear symbols that prove this point to be true is found then soon after, and still within the first chapter of Genesis. And this is the introduction of water and land. Now this is just a small verse that I'm going to read to you, but you can find it if you wish. It's it's in the 9th and 10th verse of chapter 1. So I'll read it here. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so that's our verse in Genesis. So we can see how the symbol of water can connect to the feminine if we think of the primordial waters that were spoken of in the first paragraph of Genesis, right? And like we had already talked about, these waters represent the void of both chaos and potential. So we can see that the primordial waters are very much like the feminine womb, because they both show us as that kind of void, right? And you can imagine this as far as water is concerned, because the sea, with no land in sight, would give you that same feeling of being lost, having no direction, okay? And this is why the Voyagers always looked up to the heavens for guidance, because the constellations were what guided them and showed them the way, right? All right, so think of it like this. The ocean, in some sense, poses a question, and the question would be, what is the potential that's on the other side? What awaits on through the endless blue, right? And then thereafter, as some time passes, because remember the feminine has the trait of time, we come to find the answer. And this is when land suddenly appears. So land then becomes our masculine trait. So the easiest way to understand this is to remember that the masculine spirit is what informs. It gives identity to the womb. So from the womb emerges life, just as from the waters emerges the land. All right, so it's basically, generally, it's the same concept, okay? So from what we see as a blanket of endless waves, right, the chaotic waters, we can see that land appear, right? And this would be basically the same as what we would described as sacred space, okay, in the last video. All right. So here's a fun little example I have here. Imagine that you were Tom Hanks, right? You're floating on the raft in the middle of the ocean, and your only friend was Wilson the volleyball, right? And then you suddenly see an island in the distance. You would definitely be steering yourself towards that island, right? Otherwise, what? Death, okay? But then the scripture also talks about the sea creatures that kind of can pop up and out of the waters and get you too, right? And these are like, we often refer them to sharks. This is the Jaws movie, you know. But basically, they can come up out of these chaotic waters and actually swallow you up just before you get to the land, right? And this would be almost like the Leviathan swallowing up Jonah. But this now also opens up a whole other psychological way of looking at this, okay? So what could the water mean then psychologically, okay? And then what could the land mean psychologically? Well, because we can consider the water as feminine, she is then relative to the idea of spirit, which again we spoke of in the last video. And what we can commonly associate with spirit, at least on the psychological front, is our feelings, our emotions, right? So that feminine character is well known for her feelings and her emotions, okay? And biologically speaking, this is important for the upbringing of children, okay? Because children can be difficult, and you need that feeling aspect to connect and to energize, all right? So that the mother can overcome her pain and her exhaustion and all of that, basically to be drawn in and to preserve the life of the infant child, right? But there is another interesting aspect to emotion, and we can attribute that to what we call intuition, all right? So let's think of it this way. How often do we hear people say, I feel the Spirit leading me in this direction or leading me in that direction, right? This is a feeling, okay? But it's not always a very clear feeling, all right? It's not like, it wouldn't be the same as if we had a plan and we were following a plan, all right? It's not a complete strategy. It's just a mere feeling, or what we would call an intuition. When we find ourselves upset by something in life, you can feel a bit out of sorts, right? Such as something's not right, maybe within your relationship, or maybe something's wrong at work, or maybe you're just not happy with your life in general. These are feelings, these are emotions. And in some way, they're acting almost like a radar system, okay? And even though you can't see clearly whatever that problem is, your feelings are picking up on something and telling you that something needs a correction, okay? So then the masculine trait would be considered logic, okay? And this would be that light from heaven. And that light from heaven is what? It provides for you an answer. The masculine is the land and the vast of the endless sea of waves, okay? And when you finally have that aha moment and you see clearly why you have been so off with your emotions and your feelings, then you can see the changes that you have to make in order to get yourself back onto what we call solid ground, okay? See, emotions, if you think about it, the emotions first pick up the signal, they're our radar system, and then the logic puts those pieces together and then gives us our answer, all right? So I'm just going to show quickly a few verses where water and land are clearly showing this to be the case, and I'm telling you, the more that you read through all of the scripture and the more this point kind of sticks out to you, the more you see this pattern, the more undeniable it really kind of becomes, right? One example, which doesn't at first seem obvious, is the river that carries the infant Moses and leads him into the land of Egypt. So what happens in the land of Egypt will then provide the answer to his watery journey that he took, right? The reason why he was traveling up the river in the first place will be answered later in the through the Exodus story. But this is also basically a rendition of Noah and the ark, all right? Where, of course, the water came, flooded all the land because there had to be some big changes to happen, right? And the answer was not yet clear, okay? And it wasn't settled, but it was safely contained within the ark, just as Moses was contained within the basket. And it traveled up those waters, or traveled through the flood, until it came to dry land. And there, life can restart, or, the process of whatever God was doing could then come to life or come to fruition. But now let's take a look at this from an opposite perspective. Imagine someone who is almost too set in their ways, right? let's say that they're the kind of person that pretty much has everything figured out, right? No confusion. They certainly don't feel like they're floating on water or anything, and they would consider themselves pretty solid, right? But then maybe the rest of the world doesn't agree with them. Okay, we know these people. This person is like all land, right? And maybe they shouldn't be. Okay, they could become the mighty mountain of the overbearing and what we would like to say narcissistic kind of ego. So what then might happen in this scenario? Yes, suddenly reality disagrees with them and they get drowned by the even more mighty flood. Now they're not on Noah's Ark anymore. They've just been pretty much destroyed by whatever, by something, by the waters that are down below, right? And we can, what's funny here, this is kind of technically is what we would consider like an ego death. Okay. All right. So, however, the point that I'm trying to make here is that Scripture is using the elements like water and land as symbols. And these symbols help us to understand the human condition and pretty much the way that all reality works. They are the clues that point us towards the mystery of existence. We see them, we experience them, and together they show us how God put a balance to the nature of things. So in other words, by understanding their characteristics and how they contrast and harmonize with each other, they can actually help us realize how these characteristics harmonize within our own human consciousness. So let's recap on these elements again, because if you really want to understand what the stories in the Bible are trying to tell us, you have to become familiar with the symbolic meaning, okay? So these are the elements that we call fire, which we said last week was masculine by the use of the sun. Air, which we said was feminine, since it represents spirit. Land, which we now have concluded to be masculine. And water, which is, of course, feminine. So these four elements, which we see continuously used in Scripture, have also been realized through nearly all spiritual practices. And within each of these practices, the elements appear to generally reflect the same meanings and attributes that are connected to them, okay? However, I will note here that many of you who are watching are familiar with the spiritual connection to these four elements and will notice that in other practices, you will often see air and land elements flipped around. So the air is actually a masculine and the land is sometimes feminine. And there's a good reason for this. And I've tried to discover basically the best way to understand why that would be the case, right? And furthermore, how we can simplify and determine how to understand these categories properly, like between the symbols of masculine and feminine. And I think I might have figured it out. So as far as the masculine and the feminine traits are concerned, if I'm correct on this, I would say that each element could be either or, masculine or feminine, depending on its application. And what I concluded is that you can basically understand that all masculine traits are something that is given from above, and all the feminine traits are something that is received or reflected from below. All right? So land, or more clearly in this aspect, we refer to as Mother Earth, is often referred to as feminine in other traditions because the land receives the sun and the rain and then reflects life back. Okay? So this is to say that the soil is now the potential, just like the womb holds the potential. And just as the womb grows life, so it is for the soils of the earth. And spirit, or that element we call air, not only receives the fire from the sun and the water from the sea, but air and forms as well, since we often say that it speaks to us and informs us through the voice of the Spirit or the whispers of the wind. So in order to tell if something is feminine or masculine, it is really a matter of looking at whether something is receiving or whether something is informing. Another way to say this is that the masculine comes from above and the feminine is given up or reflects from below. Okay? All right. So, these examples of these elements working in harmony will suddenly then become very real to us very fast when we find ourselves within a dispute, okay? Or when we find ourselves in a place where there's indifference and challenge. The idea of relationship insinuates that we have a relation with something that is other than ourselves, and that this will almost always cost us something to make that relationship possible. This means that there will almost always be, from a small degree to a larger degree, some kind of sacrifice of our own personal agency for the inclusion and the acceptance of whatever that other is. Or it may be that the other person that we're trying to relate to is too informative, that the other person is too overbearing, and that we don't feel like we can be ourselves around them. They may be trying to consume us basically for their own identity, and this would be the narcissist. So imagine that one of those elements in nature would become more than what it should be. It's a lot like being in a bad relationship, okay? So when there's too much sun, it's too hot. Nobody wants to go outside when there's a blistering heat wave, right? We avoid it. We stay in our homes, basically, and we turn on the air conditioning. And the same is true for someone who has an overbearing personality. And when it rains and rains and rains, everyone is tucked away in their shelters, just trying to stay dry. And when the rivers rise too high, when we even find ourselves having to evacuate before getting caught up in flood destruction, right? This kind of reminds us of that person who just pours out negative vibes all day long. All right? Same goes for the wind. Too much swirling spirit, too much emotion can act almost like a tornado of reckless confusion, right? And we have to bunker down into the lowest place that we can find until we feel like the storm is past. And I remember someone saying this at some point, that our emotions can be great guides, yes, but they can make horrible masters. And therefore, even though our feelings and our emotions are good, logic is also needed to keep us anchored within the eye of the storm, right? All right, so let's return back just for a quick minute to the yin-yang symbol. I've heard it said a number of times that the design clearly replicates the constellation of Pisces, that the two black and white halves swirl in a conjunction with each other in the same way that the two fish are positioned in the Pisces constellation, right? And if anyone is familiar with Pisces, they know that these two fish are in opposite positions to each other because they're supposed to represent opposite natures, turning basically in opposite directions. And it's by this constellation and its astrological location and phase that the birth of Christ is known basically to usher in the age of Pisces, right? This is known to be why it was referred to, to be the symbol of the fish in the first place, which of course we see represented still as the little Jesus stickers on the back of bumpers on everyone's car, right? But the symbol itself has some deep meaning, deep implications to it. So these symbols are both pointing basically at really the same thing. The yin yang and Christ as the fish. They're showing that there's always this tension between masculine and the feminine nature, which we would say is the same as the tension between the Father in heaven and creation below, right? So this kind of makes sense, okay? But furthermore, Christ reveals the depth of the yin-yang because he is known to be the one who stands between, okay? As fully divine, he represents the yin, and as fully flesh, he represents the yang. And so we can see that if we are called to be in the image of Christ, it is to be in balance with these natures properly, just as the yin-yang is basically saying the same thing. And if we struggle to understand what that looks like, well, God even gave us a template in which we call nature. Since we can see and generally understand just how broken and misbalanced our psychology looks like, if we compare ourselves to those extreme uprises in nature that I just talked about. So again, we must ask ourselves, are we being too informing at times, where we can find ourselves almost with that narcissistic spirit coming out? Or are we too emotional that we can't seem to ground ourselves in any kind of rationality? Where can we be more like the great mother who gives nourishment so others can be fed from us, and that they're not feeding, and that we are not feeding ourselves from the life of others, right? And where may others be overgrabbing our fruits, taking too much from us, that we will dry up like the deserts and produce no life of our own? So are we too logical like the burning sun? Are we too emotional like the swirling destructive winds or the crashing oceans? Are we too much land or are we too much water, right? And so we see again, it's all there within you, all of it. And you can feel it in yourself, and you can feel it in the relationship outside of yourself with others. These are the ways that we're being called to be in the likeness of Christ and to reflect the yin and the yang, right? Can we embody these natures? Can we calm the storm as Christ calmed the storm? Can we find our way to the promised land? And of course, can we find our way to God and to what is the most true love? If we take notice, the yin-yang is contained within a circle. The two fish may be the opposite of nature, but they are one body. And as we spoke of Christ being relative to the constellation Pisces, what age, as far as the astrological calendar goes, comes after Pisces? It's Aquarius, the water bearer. The water bearer holds the container in which the fish are bound together. Now here comes the crazy part. In Luke 22, the disciples asked Jesus where they could prepare for the Passover meal, which we'll later call the Last Supper. Jesus tells them, this is starting in verse 10, "Behold, when you enter the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters, and from there the disciples will be instructed to enter the upper room." Is it any wonder that the Last Supper consists of bread as the body and wine as the blood? Why one is a solid substance and the other a liquid? Indeed, we are made of two natures, both physically and mentally. You are of body and you are of mind. You are of blood and you are of flesh. And you are of spirit and you are of logos. The whole being is that of the garden. made of both water and land, made of both wild nature and ordered structure. And this, my friends, is the mystery that lies before us, that true creation is found by the union of what is divine with what is material, and true love is found by the union of the masculine and the feminine, the holy marriage. May we open our eyes that we may be the containers who hold this light of God, and we become the fruits of heaven. With that, God bless you all, and may the Lord guide you on that inner journey to becoming whole and balanced between these two natures, the masculine and the feminine.